Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Ghost Returns. The summer rain hammered against the cracked asphalt of Millbrook's main street as Martin Kane emerged from the shadows like a specter from hell itself. 6 months. 6 months since his Black Hawk had been shot down over hostile territory. Since he'd been declared Kia. Since his world had supposedly ended in a ball of twisted metal and flames. But Martin Kane was very much alive. His weathered face, now gaunt from months of survival, bore new scars that told stories of unimaginable hardship. The once pristine Special Forces operator had been reduced to skin and bone, his eyes hollow yet burning with an intensity that would make hardened criminals step aside. At 34, Martin had seen enough warfare to last several lifetimes, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited him at home. The two-story colonial house at 247 Elm Street looked exactly as he remembered, except for the deputy sheriff's patrol car parked brazenly in his driveway. Martin's jaw clenched as he recognized the vehicle belonging to Wayne Burns, a man he'd never trusted even before deployment. Burns was everything Martin despised: corrupt, lazy, and possessing the kind of small-town arrogance that came from wearing a badge in a place where real authority was rarely challenged. Martin had met Cheryl Kane 8 years ago at a military appreciation dinner in nearby Franklin County. She'd been 26 then, a stunning blonde with emerald eyes and a smile that could disarm a bomb. Cheryl worked as a nurse at the county hospital, came from a respectable family, and seemed like the perfect military wife. They'd married within a year, and Emma had arrived 2 years later, a beautiful daughter who became Martin's entire world. But military deployments were hard on marriages, and Martin's specialized unit meant long absences with minimal communication. He'd noticed Cheryl growing distant during his last leave, but he'd attributed it to stress. He should have known better. In the Special Forces, survival depended on reading signs others missed. At home, he'd been blind. As Martin approached his house through the backyard, staying in the shadows of the oak trees he'd planted years ago, his blood turned to ice. There, in the far corner of the yard, was a makeshift kennel, little more than a chain-link cage with a tarp for shelter. Inside, curled up on a pile of old blankets, was his 6-year-old daughter Emma. The child was painfully thin, her once bright blonde hair matted and dirty. Angry red sores dotted her arms, and she was wearing clothes that hadn't been washed in days. The sight hit Martin like a sledgehammer to the chest. His daughter, his precious little girl, was being kept like an animal in her own backyard. Rage, pure and molten, coursed through Martin's veins. Every survival instinct honed through years of combat training screamed for immediate action. But the strategic part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through impossible odds, forced him to remain still and observe. Through the kitchen window, he could see them clearly. Cheryl, still beautiful but harder somehow, was pressed against the kitchen counter. Wayne Burns, a heavy-set man with thinning brown hair and a perpetual sneer, had his hands on her waist, his sheriff's badge glinting in the overhead light. They were kissing with the desperate passion of guilty lovers, completely oblivious to the broken man watching from the darkness. Martin's hands instinctively reached for weapons that weren't there. In the POW camp, he'd survived by becoming something less than human, a creature driven purely by the will to live and return home. The camp had been run by a sadistic warlord who took pleasure in breaking strong men. Martin had endured months of torture, had watched good soldiers die, had been forced to make impossible choices just to see another dawn. But he'd survived because he'd had something to come home to. Or so he'd thought. Now, crouched in his own backyard like a ghost, Martin Kane realized that everything he'd fought for was gone. His wife had not only replaced him, but had also abandoned their daughter. The pension money from his supposed death was clearly more valuable to them than the life of an innocent child. Martin's military training kicked in as he began to assess the situation with cold precision. Wayne Burns was armed, probably carrying his service weapon and at least one backup. Cheryl would be unpredictable, civilian, but potentially dangerous if cornered. The house had multiple entry points, but any direct confrontation would traumatize Emma further. No, This situation required a different approach. Martin Kane had learned patience in the worst possible school. He could wait. As he watched his wife and her lover through the window, Martin began to formulate the beginning of a plan. These people had made the fatal mistake of underestimating a dead man. They'd forgotten that Martin Kane was the sole survivor of a POW camp where weaker men had been broken in days. They were about to learn what it meant to face a man with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Martin melted back into the shadows. His daughter's suffering burned into his memory like a brand. Before the sun rose again, the game would begin. And when it ended, Cheryl Kane and Wayne Burns would understand exactly why crossing a Special Forces operator was the last mistake they'd ever make. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of the man Martin Kane used to be. Chapter 2. The Art of War. Martin Kane had spent the last 18 hours in reconnaissance, treating his own home like an enemy stronghold. Old habits from his military days died hard, and right now, those habits were all that stood between him and a reckless assault that would destroy any chance of saving Emma. From his hidden observation post in the abandoned Hutchinson Barn 3 properties over, Martin had mapped out the daily routines of his targets with military precision. Cheryl left for her shifts at the hospital at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., alternating between day and night rotations. Wayne Burns arrived like clockwork at 7 a.m. for breakfast and stayed until noon, then returned around 8 p.m. for what Martin grimly understood to be overnight visits. But the most heartbreaking pattern was Emma's treatment. 3 times a day, Cheryl would bring out a bowl of food, usually leftovers or cheap cereal, and place it just inside the kennel. The child was allowed inside only to use the bathroom, and even then, only under supervision. It was systematic abuse, designed to break a little girl's spirit, just as surely as the POW camp had tried to break Martin's. The why of it gnawed at Martin's tactical mind. This wasn't simple neglect or even typical abuse. This was calculated cruelty with a purpose. As he observed through his military-grade binoculars, Martin began to piece together the larger picture. Wayne Burns wasn't just any corrupt small-town cop. Martin's research at the local library's computers had revealed some interesting facts. Burns had been passed over for sheriff twice, had multiple complaints filed against him for excessive force, and was currently under internal investigation for misuse of department resources. The man was desperate for both money and respect, 2 things that Martin's death benefits and widow status could provide through Cheryl. But why torture Emma? The answer came to Martin during his second night of surveillance when he overheard a conversation through the open kitchen window. "She keeps asking when Daddy's coming home," Cheryl was saying, her voice carrying a whining tone Martin had never heard before. "I'm running out of lies to tell her." "Then don't lie," Wayne's gravelly voice responded. "Kid's got to learn sooner or later that her precious daddy ain't coming back. The sooner she accepts it, the easier it'll be when we make this official. But what if someone sees her out there? Social services or who's going to see her? Your neighbors think you're the grieving war widow struggling to cope. Besides, a little hardship builds character. My old man used to chain me to the porch when I acted up, and it taught me respect." Martin's hands had clenched into fists as the true scope of their plan became clear. They weren't just stealing his life insurance and pension. They were systematically breaking his daughter's will so she'd be easier to control. Emma was being conditioned to accept abuse as normal, to stop asking questions, to stop hoping for rescue. It was psychological warfare against a 6-year-old child. That revelation had transformed Martin's anger from hot rage into something far more dangerous: cold, calculated fury. These weren't just thieves or even ordinary criminals. They were child abusers who had turned his own home into a prison camp. Martin's military background had taught him that every successful operation required 3 elements: intelligence, resources, and timing. He'd spent decades perfecting these skills in environments where failure meant death. Intelligence was flowing in steadily. Martin had discovered that Wayne Burns lived alone in a small apartment above Hendrick's hardware store on Main Street. The man had a drinking problem, a gambling debt to some unsavory characters in the county seat, and a tendency to leave his service weapon unsecured when he was drunk. Cheryl, meanwhile, had been living off Martin's presumed death benefits while maintaining her job at the hospital. Insurance fraud at minimum, but likely much more. Resources were more challenging. Martin had nothing but the clothes on his back and the survival skills burned into his DNA. But 18 months in a POW camp had taught him that a determined man could create weapons from anything. The abandoned Hutchinson property was a goldmine of forgotten tools and materials. Rusted farming equipment, old chemical containers, even a well-maintained generator that the late Edgar Hutchinson had left behind. But timing was everything. Martin couldn't just react. He had to control the entire sequence of events. One mistake, one moment of emotion overriding tactics, and Emma would suffer the consequences. As dawn broke on his third day of surveillance, Martin made his decision. Direct confrontation was off the table. These people had spent months systematically destroying his daughter's childhood, and they deserved something far more sophisticated than a simple beating. They deserved to experience the same helplessness, the same systematic destruction of everything they held dear that they had inflicted on Emma. Martin Kane had survived the worst that human cruelty could devise, and he'd learned valuable lessons in the process. Pain was temporary, but psychological warfare could destroy a person's will to live. Fear, properly applied, was more effective than any physical torture. Wayne Burns and Cheryl Kane were about to get a graduate-level education in psychological operations, taught by a master who had learned from the worst. The game was about to begin, and Martin held all the cards. They just didn't know they were playing yet. As Martin prepared to leave his observation post, he took one last look at Emma in her makeshift prison. Soon, little girl, Daddy's coming home, and he's bringing hell with him. Chapter 3. The First Move. Martin Kane struck at 3:17 a.m. on a moonless Thursday, moving through Millbrook's empty streets like a shadow given form. His first target wasn't Wayne Burns or even Cheryl. It was the foundation of their comfortable lives. The Millbrook Telegraph building stood dark and quiet on the corner of Main and 2nd, its ancient brick facade hiding the small-town newspaper that had dutifully reported Martin's death 6 months earlier. The building's security was laughable to a man who'd infiltrated enemy compounds protected by trained soldiers and electronic surveillance. Within 15 minutes, Martin was inside the building's basement archives, searching through 6 months of back issues with the methodical precision of a trained intelligence analyst. What he found made his blood run cold and his resolve turn to steel. The newspaper's coverage of his supposed death had been surprisingly detailed. Too detailed. The article, written by the paper's editor Robbie Flowers, contained information that should have been classified. Details about Martin's unit's mission, their location when the helicopter went down, even speculation about survivors that should have been restricted to military personnel and immediate family. But it was the follow-up articles that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. A week after Martin's death was reported, the Telegraph had run a puff piece about local widow Cheryl Kane's brave struggle to cope with loss. The article mentioned her work at the hospital, her dedication to her daughter, and the community support during her difficult time. What it didn't mention was that Cheryl had been seen around town with Wayne Burns just 3 days after Martin's supposed death. The timeline was damning. These two hadn't even waited for the body to get cold before they started their affair. Martin photographed every relevant article with a camera he'd liberated from the newspaper's equipment room, then moved to his second target, Wayne Burns' personnel file at the Sheriff's Department. The Millbrook Sheriff's Department was housed in a converted storefront that had seen better days. Martin had conducted reconnaissance on the building for 2 days, noting the single security camera, which hadn't worked in years, the flimsy locks, and the fact that night dispatch was handled by one elderly woman who spent most of her shift asleep at her desk. Burns' personnel file painted the picture of a man spiraling toward disgrace even before Martin's death. Multiple complaints from citizens, 3 separate internal investigations for misconduct, and a pattern of aggressive behavior that had the county sheriff's office quietly distancing themselves from Millbrook's operation. But the most damning evidence was in Burns' financial records, which Martin accessed through the department's ancient computer system. In the 6 months since Martin's death, Burns had made several large cash deposits, amounts that far exceeded his deputy salary. The deposits coincided perfectly with Cheryl's insurance payouts. Martin was building a case, but not for the courts. This was intelligence gathering for a very different kind of justice. His third stop was the most dangerous, his own house. Martin waited until 4:30 a.m., when both Cheryl and Wayne were deep in sleep. The spare key was exactly where he'd left it, hidden under the false bottom of Emma's old sandbox. As he slipped into his own home, Martin felt like a ghost visiting his former life. The house had changed in subtle but disturbing ways. His photographs had been removed from the walls and replaced with pictures of Cheryl and Wayne. His clothes were gone from the closet, his personal effects cleared out as if he'd never existed. Even worse, Emma's room had been stripped of most of her toys and furniture, leaving only a bare mattress and a few books. Martin moved through the house with practiced stealth, gathering intelligence and preparing the groundwork for what was to come. In the kitchen, he found Emma's medical records scattered on the counter, evidence that Cheryl had been documenting his daughter's behavioral problems to justify her treatment. The records painted a picture of a child suffering from severe trauma-related regression and dangerous acting-out behaviors. It was a setup. Cheryl was creating a paper trail to justify Emma's abuse, probably planning to have her committed or placed in foster care once the insurance money ran out. But Martin's most important discovery was in the basement. Hidden behind a false panel in the furnace room, he found a metal lockbox containing documents that revealed the full extent of their scheme. Life insurance policies, pension paperwork, and most damning of all, a handwritten letter from Wayne to an unknown contact discussing disposing of the kid once their financial situation was secure. The letter was signed and dated just 2 weeks ago. Martin photographed everything, then carefully returned the documents to their hiding place. These people weren't just thieves and child abusers. They were planning to murder his daughter. As dawn approached, Martin made his way back to Emma's kennel. His daughter was awake, sitting quietly in the corner and staring at the house with empty eyes that broke Martin's heart. She looked so small, so defeated, that it took every ounce of military discipline to keep from rushing to her immediately. Instead, Martin knelt in the shadows just outside the kennel and whispered softly, "Emma." The little girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Daddy," she whispered back, her voice barely audible. "Yes, baby girl. Daddy's here. But you have to be very quiet and very brave for me, okay? I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say." Emma nodded frantically, tears streaming down her dirty face. "I knew you'd come back. I told them you weren't really dead, but they said..." "Chill," Martin soothed. "I know what they said, and I know what they did to you, but that's all going to change very soon. Can you be brave for just a little while longer?" "Yes, Daddy." Martin reached through the chain link and gently touched his daughter's face. "I love you, Emma, more than anything in the world. And I promise you, the people who hurt you are going to pay for what they've done. But first, Daddy has to make sure you're safe. Can you pretend you never saw me tonight?" Emma nodded solemnly. At 6 years old, she'd already learned the survival skills that prison camps taught: how to keep secrets, how to endure, how to hope against hope. Martin spent 10 more minutes with his daughter, reassuring her and explaining that very soon, everything would change. Then he melted back into the shadows, leaving Emma with something she hadn't had in months: hope. As Martin returned to his observation post, his mind was already working through the tactical problems ahead. Wayne Burns and Cheryl Kane had declared war on his family, and they'd chosen their battlefield. Now Martin would choose his. In 72 hours, they would learn what it felt like to be hunted by a man who'd been trained to kill by the world's finest military and educated in survival by the world's cruelest enemies. The preliminaries were over. The real war was about to begin. Chapter 4: Psychological Operations. Martin Kane's war began not with bullets or bloodshed, but with the slow, methodical dismantling of his enemy's sense of security. He'd learned in the POW camp that the mind was far more fragile than the body, and fear properly applied could accomplish what brute force never could. Wayne Burns received his first message on Friday morning. The deputy sheriff stumbled out of Martin's house at 6 a.m., still buttoning his uniform shirt as he made his way to the patrol car. What he found waiting for him on the windshield was a single photograph. Burns himself, taken through the kitchen window the night before, his hands clearly visible around Cheryl's waist. But it wasn't just any photograph. It was a perfect surveillance shot, taken with professional equipment from an impossible angle. The lighting was crisp, the focus flawless, and the timestamp in the corner showed it had been taken at exactly 11:47 p.m., when Burns thought he was safe and unobserved. On the back of the photograph, written in block letters with a black marker, were 3 words, "I see you." Burns' reaction was everything Martin had hoped for. The man stood frozen beside his patrol car for nearly 5 minutes, his head swiveling as he searched the empty street for any sign of surveillance. His hand instinctively moved to his service weapon, though he had no target to draw on. Martin watched from his concealed position 3 blocks away, using the same military-grade optics he'd liberated from the abandoned National Guard armory outside town. Burns' body language told the complete story: confusion, fear, and the dawning realization that someone was watching him. Phase 1, establish surveillance. Complete. The second message arrived at Cheryl's workplace that afternoon. Martin had spent the morning learning the layout of Millbrook General Hospital, paying particular attention to the nursing station where his wife worked. The hospital security was focused on preventing theft of drugs and equipment, not on stopping a determined infiltrator who knew how to move through institutional buildings. Cheryl's locker in the staff break room contained the usual personal items: makeup, spare scrubs, family photos that conspicuously featured Wayne Burns, but not Martin or Emma. Hidden among her belongings, Martin placed a manila envelope containing a single item: Emma's birth certificate, with a handwritten note attached. "She calls your name when she cries at night. But you already know that, don't you? A friend." The beauty of the message wasn't just its content. It was the impossibility of its delivery. Cheryl's locker required a combination that only she knew, and it was located in a restricted area of the hospital. Someone had not only gained access to her most secure personal space, but had done so without being detected by any of the building's security measures. Martin monitored Cheryl's reaction through the hospital's own security cameras, which he'd learned to access through the building's poorly secured computer network. When she found the envelope, Cheryl's face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, naked terror. She spent the rest of her shift looking over her shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound, and making 3 separate phone calls to Wayne Burns. Martin couldn't hear the conversations, but he could read lips well enough to catch fragments. "Someone knows. Inside my locker. Watching us." Phase 2, establish omnipresence. Complete. But Martin's psychological campaign wasn't limited to his primary targets. A successful operation required controlling all variables, including potential witnesses and allies. Robbie Flowers, the newspaper editor who'd written the detailed accounts of Martin's death, found his own surprise on Saturday morning. Arriving at the telegraph office, Flowers discovered that someone had broken into his computer system and printed out dozens of copies of a single document. The original military report about Martin Kane's mission, clearly marked classified and containing information that had never been released to the press. The implication was clear and terrifying. Flowers had published classified information in his newspaper articles, information he couldn't have obtained through legitimate channels. Someone had been feeding him restricted intelligence, and now someone else knew about it. Along with the printed documents was a simple note: "Interesting sources you have, Mr. Flowers. We should discuss them soon. A concerned citizen." Martin watched from across the street as Flowers discovered the breach. The man's reaction was immediate panic, followed by a frantic phone call that Martin's carefully placed listening device picked up clearly. "Wayne, we have a problem," Flowers said into his cell phone. "Someone knows about the information you gave me for those articles. They broke into my office and, yes, I'm sure it was secured. Wayne, this is serious. If the military finds out I published classified details." The conversation continued for 10 minutes, revealing the extent of the conspiracy. Wayne Burns had been feeding classified information to Flowers in exchange for favorable coverage of Cheryl's situation. It was a minor violation compared to their other crimes, but it established a pattern of corruption that Martin would exploit. Phase 3. Isolate the targets from potential allies. Complete. By Sunday evening, Martin's psychological operation was achieving its intended effect. Wayne Burns had requested additional patrols of his apartment building and had started carrying a backup weapon in an ankle holster. Cheryl had begun taking different routes to work and had asked hospital security to escort her to her car after late shifts. Most importantly, they'd started to turn on each other. Martin's surveillance equipment captured their Sunday night argument in vivid detail. Wayne had arrived at the house already agitated, convinced that someone from his past, maybe a criminal he'd arrested, maybe someone from internal affairs, was stalking him. "This is about you, not me," he snarled at Cheryl as they stood in the kitchen. "Someone's trying to get to me through you. Maybe it's time we cooled things off for a while." "You can't just abandon me now," Cheryl shot back. "We're in this together, Wayne. If you go down, I go down. Nobody's going down if we're smart about this. But I'm not taking risks for some dead soldier's wife and her psycho kid." The mention of Emma as a psycho kid required every ounce of Martin's discipline to remain in position. But the argument was providing valuable intelligence about their relationship dynamics and future plans. "The kid's becoming a liability anyway," Wayne continued. "Maybe it's time we dealt with that situation permanently." "What do you mean, dealt with?" "You know what I mean. Make it look like an accident. Tragic case of a disturbed child hurting herself. You're a nurse. You know how to make things look natural." Martin's blood turned to ice as the full implication hit him. They weren't just planning to abandon Emma. They were planning to murder her and make it look like suicide. The psychological phase of Martin's operation had accomplished its primary objective. It had forced his enemies to reveal their true intentions and their ultimate timeline. But it had also revealed something far more urgent. Emma was in immediate danger. Martin's careful, methodical approach had just been compressed into a matter of hours. Whatever happened next, it had to happen fast before Wayne and Cheryl decided that disposing of witnesses was their best option. As Martin prepared to escalate from psychological warfare to direct action, he allowed himself one moment of savage satisfaction. Wayne Burns and Cheryl Kane thought they were being hunted by some unknown enemy from their past. They had no idea they were being stalked by a ghost who was very much alive and had nothing left to lose. The gloves were about to come off. Chapter 5. The Hunter's Web. Monday morning brought rain and revelation. Martin Kane had spent the night constructing the infrastructure for what military tacticians called a total environment operation, a mission where every variable was controlled, every move anticipated, and every outcome predetermined. His workshop was the abandoned Hutchinson barn, transformed over the past week into a command center that would have impressed his former Special Forces unit. Maps of Millbrook covered one wall, marked with movement patterns, surveillance points, and tactical routes. Another wall displayed photographs and documents detailing every aspect of Wayne Burns and Cheryl's lives, their schedules, their contacts, their weaknesses, and their fears. But the centerpiece of Martin's operation was a custom-built communications array that allowed him to monitor and intercept every electronic communication in Millbrook. Cell phone calls, text messages, email, even the antiquated radio system used by the sheriff's department. Everything flowed through Martin's equipment and into his growing intelligence file. The accelerated timeline meant shifting from psychological pressure to active manipulation. Martin's targets needed to be maneuvered into position for the final phase, and that required more direct intervention. Wayne Burns' Monday began with a phone call that would change everything. At 7:15 a.m., as Burns sat in his patrol car outside the diner where he grabbed breakfast every morning, his cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Millbrook General, which made sense since Cheryl was working the early shift. "Wayne Burns," he answered, but the voice on the other end wasn't Cheryl's. It was electronically distorted, professionally altered to be unrecognizable, but clearly male. "Deputy Burns, you need to listen very carefully. Your friend Cheryl is in danger." Burns sat up straight in his seat. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" "That's not important. What's important is that someone has been asking questions about you and Mrs. Kane." someone with military credentials and access to classified databases. Martin watched Burns' reaction through his telephoto lens, noting the man's increasing agitation. The beauty of the call wasn't just the fear it induced. It was the way it would drive Burns toward exactly the wrong conclusion. Are you talking about federal agents? Military investigators? I'm talking about someone who knows about your arrangement with Mrs. Kane. Someone who knows about the insurance money, the falsified reports, and what you've been doing to the child. Burns' face went white. You're full of shit. Nobody knows. Deputy, I'm trying to help you here. This individual has been conducting surveillance on both of you for several days. Professional-grade equipment, military tactics. You need to take Mrs. Kane and the child and get out of town. Today, the line went dead, leaving Burns staring at his phone in terror. Martin's manipulated phone call had accomplished several objectives simultaneously. It confirmed Burns' worst fears about being watched by professionals, provided a false explanation for the surveillance that would misdirect any investigation, and most importantly, introduced the idea of flight, exactly what Martin needed his targets to attempt. Phase 1 of Monday's operation: force the enemy to consider retreat. Complete. But Martin wasn't finished with Wayne Burns. At 10:30 a.m., Burns received a text message from an unknown number. Check your apartment. Third floorboard from the window. Someone left you a present. A friend. Burns was at his apartment within 15 minutes, his service weapon drawn as he climbed the stairs to his second-floor residence. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry, but the third floorboard from the living room window was indeed loose. Underneath, Burns found a waterproof pouch containing items that made his blood run cold. Detailed photographs of his apartment's interior, copies of his bank statements showing the insurance deposits, and a handwritten timeline documenting his relationship with Cheryl going back 8 months. But the most terrifying item was a military dog tag. Martin Kane's dog tag, which should have been lost with his body in the helicopter crash. The accompanying note was brief. I'm closer than you think. MK. Martin monitored Burns' reaction through the listening devices he'd planted throughout the apartment. The man's panicked phone call to Cheryl was everything Martin had hoped for. He's alive, Burns whispered into the phone. Kane is alive, and he's been watching us. We need to run. Now. That's impossible, Cheryl's voice crackled through the phone's speaker. The military confirmed he was dead. I saw the reports. Then explain how his dog tag ended up under my floorboard next to photos of us together. Cheryl, this guy is Special Forces. You know what that means? He's trained to kill people like us. Martin smiled grimly as he listened to their growing panic. Fear was making them sloppy, driving them toward the exact response he needed. What about Emma? Cheryl asked. What about her? She's just extra baggage now. We take the money we've got and disappear. Let social services deal with the kid. Wayne, we can't just abandon her. If Kane is really alive, she's the only leverage we have. There it was. Martin's pulse quickened as he heard Cheryl articulate the tactical reality he'd been counting on. They would try to use Emma as a human shield, which meant they'd have to move her from the kennel to a more secure location. That movement would be Martin's opportunity. Fine, Burns said after a long pause. But we do this smart. We take the kid with us tonight, drive to the county seat, and figure out our next move from there. If Kane really is alive, he'll follow us. And when he does, we'll be ready for him. Where do we meet? The Old Quarry Road, 11 p.m. Bring whatever cash you've got, and anything else we might need. And Cheryl? Bring something to keep the kid quiet. We can't have her screaming if we need to move fast. Martin felt a chill at the implication, but his tactical mind was already calculating distances, routes, and timing. The Old Quarry was perfect for his purposes, isolated, with multiple approach routes, and far enough from town that civilian interference was impossible. Phase 2. Force the enemy to move to ground of your choosing. Complete. But Martin had one more manipulation to execute before the night's operation. At 3 p.m., Robbie Flowers received an unexpected visitor at the telegraph office. A man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Agent Christopher Elliott from the Department of Defense's Criminal Investigation Division. Mr. Flowers, we need to discuss your recent articles about Staff Sergeant Martin Kane's death. Specifically, We need to know where you obtained classified information about his unit's mission. Of course, there was no Agent Elliot from the DoD. Martin had simply bought a generic badge holder online and printed official-looking credentials using the newspaper's own equipment. But Flowers didn't know that, and his guilty conscience filled in the details. I can't reveal my sources," Flowers stammered. "Mr. Flowers, publishing classified military information is a federal crime. We're prepared to offer immunity in exchange for your cooperation, but only if you tell us everything you know about Deputy Wayne Burns' involvement in this matter." The interview lasted 30 minutes, during which Flowers revealed everything about his arrangement with Burns. More importantly, he provided Martin with confirmation that Burns had been selling information from military databases that he shouldn't have had access to, evidence of a much larger corruption network. But the real purpose of the interview was to plant information that would reach Burns within hours. "Mr. Flowers, I need you to understand something. Staff Sergeant Kane's death is now under federal investigation. If he's still alive, and we have reason to believe he might be, then anyone who participated in fraud related to his death benefits will face federal charges. I strongly advise you to distance yourself from Deputy Burns immediately." By 6 p.m., Flowers had called Burns with a panicked report about the federal investigation. Martin listened to the call with savage satisfaction as Burns' paranoia reached new heights. "They know everything, Wayne. They know about the classified information. They know about the insurance fraud. And they think Kane might still be alive. You need to get out of town tonight." "Already planning on it," Burns replied. "But if Kane is alive and the feds are involved, this just became a whole different kind of problem." Martin checked his equipment one final time as the sun set over Millbrook. Tonight, Wayne Burns and Cheryl Kane would attempt to kidnap his daughter and flee. They thought they were escaping from federal agents and a dead man's ghost. They had no idea they were walking into a trap designed by someone who had survived the worst that human cruelty could devise and learned to turn that knowledge into a weapon. At 11 p.m., 3 vehicles would converge on the old quarry road. Only one would leave, and Emma Kane would finally be going home. Chapter 6. The Perfect Trap. The abandoned limestone quarry sat like a wound in the earth, its steep walls and dark water creating a natural amphitheater of shadows and echoes. Martin Kane had chosen this location not just for its isolation, but for its tactical advantages, multiple approach routes, controlled sight lines, and most importantly, no escape routes that he couldn't monitor and block. As 10:45 p.m. approached, Martin made his final preparations from his concealed position on the quarry's north ridge. Below him, the access road was empty except for the rusted machinery that had been abandoned when the quarry closed 15 years ago. His night vision equipment turned the moonless evening into a green-tinted battlefield where he held every advantage. Martin's trap was elegant in its simplicity. 3 pressure-activated flares marked the only safe path down to the quarry floor, invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible through his thermal imaging. Anyone approaching by vehicle would be forced to follow that exact route, bringing them directly into his kill zone. But this wasn't about killing, at least not yet. This was about rescue and capture, which required precision, timing, and absolute control of the situation. At 10:58 p.m., the first vehicle approached. Wayne Burns' patrol car, moving slowly down the winding quarry road with its headlights dimmed. Martin tracked the vehicle through his scope as it navigated the treacherous path, noting that Burns was alone in the front seat. 2 minutes later, Cheryl's sedan followed the same route. Through his thermal imaging, Martin could see 2 heat signatures in the car, Cheryl in the driver's seat and a smaller figure in the back that had to be Emma. Both vehicles reached the quarry floor and parked near the old equipment shed, exactly where Martin had anticipated. The isolation was perfect. The nearest house was 3 miles away, and the quarry's walls would contain any sound from the operation. Martin activated his first surprise. The floodlights he'd rigged throughout the quarry suddenly blazed to life, turning night into harsh day and temporarily blinding anyone who'd been relying on natural night vision. Burns and Cheryl stumbled out of their vehicles, hands raised to shield their eyes from the unexpected illumination. Wayne Burns, Cheryl Kane. Martin's voice boomed from the PA system he'd installed, electronically amplified and distorted to seem like it was coming from everywhere at once. You are surrounded. Move away from the vehicles with your hands visible. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Both targets spun in circles, looking for the source of the voice and finding nothing but empty quarry walls and blinding lights. Burns reached for his service weapon, but stopped when a rifle shot cracked through the air, sending stone chips flying from the wall inches from his head. The next shot won't miss. Step away from the vehicles. Now, Burns and Cheryl moved away from their cars, hands raised, squinting into the lights and searching frantically for their unseen captor. Martin could see the terror in their body language, the rapid breathing, the constant movement, the way they pressed close together for psychological comfort. But Martin's focus was on the sedan, where Emma remained trapped in the back seat. "Emma," Martin said, switching to a normal-speaking voice that carried clearly in the quarry's acoustics. "It's Daddy. I need you to get out of the car and walk toward the sound of my voice. Don't be scared, baby girl. You're safe now." The car door opened, and Emma's small figure emerged into the harsh lights. She was wearing the same dirty clothes Martin had seen her in for days, but she was moving under her own power and seemed uninjured. "Emma, walk toward the big rocks on your right. There's a path up the hill. Follow it until you see the blue light, then wait for me there. Can you do that?" "Yes, Daddy," Emma's small voice carried across the quarry. As she began walking toward the escape route Martin had prepared, both Wayne and Cheryl started to move in her direction. Another rifle shot, this one striking the ground directly between them and Emma, stopped them cold. "Move toward the child and you die. She is no longer your concern." Martin watched through his scope as Emma found the path he'd marked with reflective tape and began climbing toward the safe zone he'd established on the ridge. His daughter was showing remarkable courage for a 6-year-old, following his instructions precisely despite the chaos around her. Once Emma was clear of the kill zone, Martin began Phase 2 of his operation. "Wayne Burns," he called out, his voice now coming from a different direction as he switched between speakers. "6 months ago, you thought you were stealing from a dead man. How does it feel to discover that your victim lived long enough to come home?" "Kane," Burns shouted into the lights. "If that's really you, we can work this out. The insurance money, the benefits, we can split it all. There's enough for everyone." Martin's laugh echoed off the quarry walls like the sound of breaking glass. "You kept my daughter in a cage, Wayne. You fed her scraps like an animal and planned to murder her when she became inconvenient. Do you really think I'm interested in negotiating?" "That was Cheryl's idea," Burns shouted, desperation making his voice crack. "I told her it was wrong, but she said, 'He's lying.'" Cheryl screamed. "It was his plan from the beginning. He said we had to break her spirit, so she wouldn't cause problems later." Martin smiled coldly as his targets began to turn on each other, exactly as he'd hoped. Fear and desperation were destroying whatever loyalty had existed between them. "Both of you participated in the systematic abuse of my daughter," Martin's voice boomed through the speakers. "Both of you profited from my supposed death. Both of you planned to commit murder to cover your crimes. Now, both of you are going to pay the price." Burns made a desperate grab for his weapon, but Martin was ready. The rifle shot took the deputy in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. Cheryl screamed and ran toward the quarry's edge, but Martin had anticipated that response as well. The second shot shattered her left ankle, dropping her to the rocky ground 20 feet from the water's edge. Neither wound was fatal, but both were incapacitating. Martin had spent too much time in military medicine to make mistakes about anatomy and bullet placement. "Emma," Martin called out, his voice gentle again. "Are you at the blue light?" "Yes, Daddy," came the reply from high above. "Good girl. Wait for me there. I'll be with you in just a few minutes." Martin began his descent into the quarry, rifle at the ready and night vision goggles, allowing him to move confidently through the shadows between the floodlights. Wayne Burns was unconscious from blood loss and shock, but Cheryl was still awake and coherent despite her shattered ankle. As Martin approached his wife, his former wife, she looked up at him with a mixture of terror and desperate cunning. "Martin, please," she whispered. "I know how this looks. But you don't understand. Wayne forced me into this. He threatened Emma and me if I didn't cooperate. I was protecting her the only way I could. Martin knelt beside Cheryl, his face inches from hers. In the harsh light, she could see the changes that months of captivity and survival had carved into his features. This wasn't the gentle soldier who'd left for deployment. This was something far more dangerous. You kept our daughter in a cage, Martin said quietly. You documented false behavioral problems to justify abusing her. You planned to murder her when the insurance money ran out. And now you want me to believe you were protecting her. Martin, do you know what they did to me in that camp, Cheryl? Do you know what I survived to come home to my family? Martin's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. They tried to break me with pain, with fear, with hopelessness. But I endured it all because I had something to come home to, because I had a wife and daughter who needed me. Martin stood and looked down at the woman who had shared his bed and borne his child. You destroyed that. You took the one thing that kept me alive through hell and turned it into another nightmare. So now you get to experience what real hopelessness feels like. Martin checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. Perfect timing. In 13 minutes, the Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department will receive an anonymous call about screams and gunshots at the old quarry. They'll arrive to find Deputy Wayne Burns suffering from a gunshot wound and blood loss. They'll also find Cheryl Kane, who tragically fell while trying to escape after being caught in the act of child abduction and insurance fraud. Cheryl's eyes widened as she understood the implication. Martin, you can't. The fall will have caused catastrophic injuries. Broken bones, internal bleeding, probably a few hours of agony before death. Very tragic. Very accidental. Martin began walking toward the path that would take him back to Emma, then paused and looked back at his former wife. Of course, there's another option. You could try to crawl to safety in the next 13 minutes. It's only about 200 yards to the road. Should be possible, even with a shattered ankle. If you're tough enough. As Martin disappeared into the shadows, Cheryl began her desperate crawl toward the quarry road, leaving a trail of blood on the limestone. Behind her, Wayne Burns remained unconscious and bleeding, his survival dependent on how quickly the fire department responded to Martin's upcoming call. Martin found Emma waiting exactly where he'd told her, sitting on a blanket he'd prepared earlier and holding a small teddy bear he'd left for her. When she saw him approaching, she ran into his arms with a sob of relief. It's over, baby girl, Martin whispered into her hair. You're safe now. You're coming home with Daddy, and nobody will ever hurt you again. As Martin carried his daughter away from the quarry, he could hear Cheryl's screams echoing off the stone walls behind them. She was still crawling, still fighting for survival with the same desperation he'd shown in the POW camp. Whether she made it to the road in time would depend on her will to live. Martin found he didn't particularly care either way. Chapter 7. Ghosts and Reckoning. 3 days after the quarry incident, Martin Kane sat in the kitchen of a rented farmhouse 15 miles outside Millbrook, watching his daughter eat her first real meal in months. Emma had gained 2 pounds already, and the haunted look was beginning to fade from her eyes. But the healing would take time for both of them. The official story, as reported by the Millbrook Telegraph and echoed by regional news outlets, was both tragic and convenient. Deputy Wayne Burns had been shot while investigating reports of suspicious activity at the old quarry. Cheryl Kane, the widow of a fallen soldier, had apparently been lured there by an unknown assailant who'd been extorting her over insurance benefits. Burns survived his shoulder wound, but faced federal charges for his role in an insurance fraud scheme. His cooperation with investigators had revealed a network of corruption involving falsified death reports and misuse of classified military information. The deputy's career was over, his pension lost, and his reputation destroyed. Cheryl Kane had been less fortunate. She'd managed to crawl nearly 100 yards before blood loss and shock overcame her. The volunteer fire department found her unconscious but alive, though her injuries were severe enough to require emergency surgery and weeks of intensive care. Her recovery would be long and painful, marked by permanent disability and the knowledge that she'd lost everything: her daughter, her freedom, and her future. Most importantly to Martin, she'd lost any legal claim to Emma. The investigation into the quarry incident was being handled by Agent Christopher Elliott of the DOD's Criminal Investigation Division, or rather, by the man everyone believed to be Agent Elliott. Martin's false identity had held up under scrutiny, aided by his genuine knowledge of military procedures and his access to classified databases through channels his former unit commanders would never have approved. The beauty of Martin's deception was its simplicity. By positioning himself as the federal investigator, he controlled the flow of information and could direct the investigation away from any inconsistencies in his story. The real DOD would eventually realize that no Agent Elliott existed, but by then, the local investigation would be closed and Martin would have disappeared. But there were still loose ends to tie up, and Martin Kane had never been a man to leave jobs unfinished. Robbie Flowers received his final visit on Thursday afternoon. The Telegraph editor looked up from his computer to find Agent Elliott standing in his office doorway, his expression grim and his manner suggesting that the investigation had taken a serious turn. "Mr. Flowers, we need to discuss your future with the Department of Defense." "I told you everything I know," Flowers protested. "I gave you all the documents, all the communications with Burns. I've cooperated completely." "Yes, you have. And that cooperation has saved you from federal prosecution. However, there are conditions attached to your immunity agreement." Martin placed a thick folder on Flowers' desk, his movements deliberate and official. "You're going to publish one final story about the Kane case. You're going to write it exactly as I dictate, and you're going to ensure it reaches every major news outlet in the region." The story that appeared in the Telegraph's Friday edition was a masterpiece of misdirection and closure. It detailed the corruption investigation, the insurance fraud scheme, and the tragic circumstances that had led to Cheryl Kane's downfall. But most importantly, it confirmed that Staff Sergeant Martin Kane had indeed died in the helicopter crash, his body recovered and properly buried in Arlington National Cemetery. The article included interviews with military officials, actually Martin using voice modulation technology, and photographs of the burial ceremony, carefully staged images from other military funerals. To anyone reading the story, Martin Kane was definitively dead, his case closed, and his family's suffering finally at an end. The psychological operation was complete. Martin Kane, the soldier, was officially buried. Marcus Elliott, the federal investigator, would disappear when the case was closed, and the ghost who'd returned to Millbrook would fade back into the shadows from which he'd emerged. But Martin wasn't finished with Wayne Burns. The former deputy was recovering in the county hospital, his shoulder healing, but his future destroyed. The federal investigation had uncovered enough evidence to send him to prison for years, but Martin wanted a more personal form of justice. On Friday night, Martin visited Burns' hospital room. The man was alone, sedated but conscious, his right arm immobilized by surgical hardware. When he saw Martin enter the room, Burns' eyes widened with recognition and terror. "You," he whispered. "Hello, Wayne." Martin closed the door behind him and activated a small electronic device that would interfere with the room's monitoring equipment. "I thought we should have a conversation. You're supposed to be dead. The newspaper said. The newspaper prints what it's told to print. Just like you told Robbie Flowers what to write about my supposed death." Martin pulled a chair close to Burns' bed and sat down. "Did you really think I wouldn't figure out how you got classified information about my mission?" Burns tried to sit up, but winced at the pain in his shoulder. "Look, Kane, I know you're angry, but..." "Angry?" Martin's laugh was soft and dangerous. "Wayne, angry doesn't begin to describe what I am. You sold information about my unit to finance your affair with my wife. You kept my daughter in a cage and planned to murder her. You destroyed my family while profiting from my supposed death. Angry is far too small a word for what you've awakened in me." Martin leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you know what I learned in that POW camp, Wayne? I learned that there are fates worse than death. I learned that a strong man can be broken not by pain, but by helplessness, by watching everything he cares about destroyed while he's powerless to stop it." Burns' breathing became rapid and shallow as Martin continued. "You're going to prison, Wayne. Federal prison, where corrupt cops don't last very long. But before you go, I want you to understand something. I'm going to be watching you. Every day, every hour, for the rest of your miserable life. Martin produced a photograph and placed it on Burns' chest. It showed the interior of Burns' hospital room, taken from an impossible angle that suggested surveillance equipment hidden somewhere in the walls. I know where you'll be transferred. I know which prison, which cell block, which inmates have particular feelings about men who hurt children. I know your routine, your habits, your fears. And I'll be there, in the shadows, making sure you never forget what you did to my family. Burns was hyperventilating now, his heart monitor beeping frantically. You can't? The nurses will come. The nurses think you're having nightmares about the shooting. Very common for trauma victims. They'll give you some medication and tell you to rest. Martin stood and looked down at Burns with cold satisfaction. But the nightmares are real, Wayne, and they're going to follow you for the rest of your life. As Martin moved toward the door, Burns found his voice one last time. What about Cheryl? What about your wife? Martin paused without turning around. Cheryl Kane died the moment she put my daughter in that cage. The woman in the ICU is just a stranger who happens to share her name. She'll live with her injuries, her shame, and the knowledge that she destroyed everything for a corrupt cop and some insurance money. That's punishment enough. Martin opened the door and looked back at Burns one final time. Enjoy prison, Wayne. Try not to think about all the ways I might be watching you. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Wayne Burns alone with his terror and the photograph that proved he would never truly be alone again. As Martin walked through the hospital corridors, his phone buzzed with a text message from the secure number he'd given Emma's temporary guardian. She's asking when you're coming home. Martin smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed since his return to Millbrook. Home. After everything he'd endured, everything he'd lost and reclaimed, the word finally meant something again. He had a daughter to raise, a new life to build, and a future to create from the ashes of his past. The ghosts of Millbrook were finally at rest. And Martin Kane, the man who died in a helicopter crash and been reborn in hell, was ready to live again. Chapter 8. New Foundations. 6 months after the quarry incident, Martin Kane stood in the doorway of Emma's new bedroom, watching his daughter sleep peacefully for the first time since his return. The nightmares had finally stopped coming, replaced by dreams of horses and playgrounds and all the normal things a 7-year-old should dream about. The farmhouse in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains was everything Millbrook had never been. Isolated but not lonely, secure but not confined, peaceful but not stagnant. Martin had purchased it using funds from carefully liquidated overseas accounts that his former unit had never known existed. The official story was that Marcus Elliott, the federal investigator, had taken early retirement and moved to the mountains for his health. Emma was thriving in ways that amazed her new therapist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who specialized in childhood trauma recovery. The physical scars were healing faster than anyone had expected, but more importantly, Emma's spirit was returning. She laughed again, played again, and most crucially, trusted again. Daddy. Emma's voice came softly from her bed as Martin entered the room. I'm here, sweetheart. Did you have another dream? Not a bad one, Emma said, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. I dreamed about the horses again. The white one with the black spots wanted me to ride her. Martin sat on the edge of Emma's bed and smoothed her hair, marveling at how healthy she looked. Good food, medical care, and unconditional love had transformed his daughter from the broken child he'd found in that cage back into the bright, curious girl she was meant to be. Maybe we should visit the Hendersons' ranch again this weekend, Martin suggested. Mrs. Henderson said you could help feed the horses if you wanted to. Emma's eyes lit up with excitement. Really? Could I maybe learn to ride one? We'll see. But first, you need to get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day, remember? Emma nodded solemnly. Tomorrow was the day she would testify via video link in Wayne Burns' federal trial. Dr. Mitchell had prepared her extensively, but Martin knew it would still be difficult for his daughter to relive those months of captivity and abuse. Burns' trial had become a significant case in the region, highlighting corruption in small-town law enforcement and the vulnerability of military families. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case using the evidence Martin had gathered, supplemented by Burns' own desperate attempts to plea bargain his way to a reduced sentence. But Burns' cooperation hadn't saved him from the justice Martin had promised. Federal prison had been exactly as harsh as Martin had predicted. Burns survived 2 assault attempts in his first month, spent 6 weeks in solitary confinement for his own protection, and developed the kind of paranoid anxiety that made every shadow a potential threat. The former deputy had aged 10 years and 6 months, his hair turning gray and his weight dropping as stress and fear consumed him from within. Martin knew this because he'd kept his promise about watching. A network of contacts in the federal prison system, guards, inmates, and staff who owed favors to former Special Forces operators, provided regular updates on Burns' condition and state of mind. The man lived in constant fear, never knowing when or where Martin's influence might reach him next. It was a more satisfying revenge than any physical punishment could have been. Cheryl's fate had been different, but equally final. Her recovery from the quarry incident had been complicated by infections, surgical complications, and the kind of depression that comes from losing everything that once defined your existence. She would walk again, eventually, but with permanent limitations that served as daily reminders of her choices. More devastating than her physical injuries was her complete social destruction. The insurance fraud investigation had revealed the full extent of her betrayal, and the community that had once supported her as a grieving war widow now viewed her with disgust and contempt. She'd been forced to sell the house on Elm Street to pay legal fees and medical bills, and her nursing license had been permanently revoked. Martin had received word that she'd left the state entirely, probably seeking anonymity in some distant city where her story wasn't common knowledge. He felt no satisfaction in her suffering, but no sympathy either. She had made her choices, and consequences were inevitable. The last loose end had been Robbie Flowers, who had proven surprisingly adaptable to his new circumstances. The Telegraph editor had parlayed his cooperation with the federal investigation into a book deal, writing a true crime account of small-town corruption that had become a regional bestseller. Flowers had been careful to stick to the official narrative about Martin's death, and his book had actually helped cement the fiction that Special Forces veteran Martin Cain was buried in Arlington Cemetery. As Emma settled back into sleep, Martin reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been a soldier fighting overseas battles in service of his country. 6 months ago, he'd been a dead man walking through his own personal hell. Now he was a single father rebuilding his life in the Virginia mountains, officially invisible to the system, but more free than he'd ever been. Dr. Mitchell had suggested that Martin might benefit from therapy himself, but he'd politely declined. The POW camp had taught him everything he needed to know about processing trauma and moving forward. Some wounds were meant to scar over rather than heal completely, serving as permanent reminders of hard-learned lessons. Martin's phone buzzed with a secure message from Roland Michael, his former team leader who'd helped facilitate Martin's unofficial resurrection and relocation. The message was brief. Burns' appeal denied. 25 years minimum. Your ghost can rest easy. Martin deleted the message and powered down the phone. Roland was one of only 3 people who knew that Martin Cain had survived the helicopter crash, and he'd agreed to help only after seeing the evidence of what Burns and Cheryl had done to Emma. Even among Special Forces operators, there were lines that couldn't be crossed without consequences. But the secrecy would end someday. Emma deserved to know her real name and her father's true history when she was old enough to understand. Until then, Marcus Elliott would be the only father she knew, and that was enough. As Martin prepared for bed, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The mission was complete. His daughter was safe, his enemies had been neutralized, and his own survival was secure. For a man who'd been declared dead and written off by everyone who'd ever known him, it was a remarkably successful outcome. But Martin Cain had learned that survival was only the beginning. Now came the harder task of building something worth surviving for. Looking out his bedroom window at the peaceful Virginia countryside, Martin knew he was ready for that challenge. He'd been forged in the worst possible circumstances and had emerged with his core values intact. Now, he could focus on being the father Emma needed and deserved. The ghost of Millbrook could finally rest. The real work of living was just beginning. Chapter 9. final justice. 2 years after the quarry incident, Martin Kane received the call he'd been expecting but dreading. Wayne Burns was dead. The news came through Roland Michael, delivered in the clinical tone that former Special Forces operators used when discussing operational casualties. Burns had been found in his cell at Federal Correctional Institution Coleman, an apparent suicide by hanging. The official investigation was routine, just another corrupt cop who couldn't handle the pressure of prison life. But Martin knew better. The network of contacts he'd cultivated inside the federal prison system had kept him informed of Burns' deteriorating mental state. The former deputy had spent his final months in a state of constant paranoia, convinced that Martin was orchestrating every setback, every threat, every moment of fear he experienced behind bars. In truth, Martin had done nothing beyond his initial psychological warfare. Burns had destroyed himself through his own guilt and terror, proving that the most effective revenge was often the enemy's own imagination run wild. Emma, now 9 years old and thriving in her new life, knew nothing of Burns' death. She'd testified at his trial 3 years ago, had survived the experience with remarkable resilience, and had moved on to building the kind of childhood she'd been denied during those dark months in Millbrook. Martin saw no reason to burden her with news about a man who'd tried to destroy her life. The farmhouse in Virginia had become everything Martin had hoped it would be. Emma excelled in the local school, had made friends among the neighboring families, and showed no lasting effects from her early trauma beyond a healthy wariness of strangers. Dr. Mitchell continued to see her quarterly, more as a precaution than a necessity, and consistently reported that Emma was developing into a normal, well-adjusted child. Martin himself had found an unexpected peace in their mountain refuge. He worked as a security consultant for companies that needed discreet expertise in protecting executives and facilities. It was lucrative work that utilized his military skills while allowing him to maintain the flexible schedule that single parenthood required. But the past had one final surprise waiting for him. The knock on Martin's door came on a crisp October evening while Emma was at a sleepover with friends. Martin answered it to find a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed but showing signs of hard travel. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and her eyes held the kind of intelligence that missed very little. "Mr. Elliott? My name is Agent Cecilia Strickland, FBI. I'd like to speak with you about a case from Millbrook County." Martin's tactical mind immediately began calculating risks and responses, but his expression remained neutral. "Of course. Please come in." Agent Strickland entered the farmhouse and looked around with the trained eye of an investigator. She noted the security systems, the strategic placement of furniture, and the subtle modifications that turned a rural home into a defensible position. "Interesting setup you have here," she observed. "Very thorough for a retired federal investigator." "Old habits," Martin replied. "Can I offer you coffee? It's on a long drive from wherever you started." "Washington, actually. And yes, coffee would be appreciated." As Martin prepared coffee in the kitchen, Agent Strickland continued her casual inspection of the house. She paused at a framed photograph showing Martin and Emma at a county fair, both of them laughing as they shared cotton candy. "Beautiful daughter," she said when Martin returned with 2 mugs. "She looks happy." "She is. We both are." Martin handed her the coffee and gestured toward the living room chairs. "What case did you want to discuss?" Agent Strickland settled into her chair and fixed Martin with a steady gaze. "The problem with your Millbrook investigation, Mr. Elliott, is that it was too perfect. Every piece of evidence fell into place exactly as needed. Every witness told exactly the right story. And most remarkably, the primary investigator managed to tie up every loose end without leaving a single unanswered question." Martin sipped his coffee and waited. In interrogation situations, the first person to speak usually gave away more than they intended. "The FBI doesn't usually review local corruption cases," Strickland continued, "but the Millbrook situation caught our attention because of some unusual elements. For instance, the classified military information that Deputy Burns allegedly accessed should have triggered immediate DoD security protocols. But there's no record of any security breach being reported through proper channels." Martin nodded thoughtfully. "That is unusual. Perhaps the information wasn't as classified as we initially believed. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone with the right clearances and access codes obtained the information through legitimate channels and then used it to construct a narrative that served their purposes. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Martin recognized the interrogation technique. Present a theory and wait for the subject to either confirm or deny it through body language and verbal responses. Agent Strickland, Martin said finally, "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, but I documented every aspect of my investigation in Millbrook." The evidence spoke for itself. Yes, it did. Almost too clearly. Strickland leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Elliott, what do you know about Staff Sergeant Martin Kane?" What the investigation revealed. He died in a helicopter crash. His widow and her boyfriend defrauded the government of his death benefits, and his daughter suffered terrible abuse as a result. It was a tragic case that ended with appropriate justice. Appropriate justice, Strickland repeated. That's an interesting phrase. Some might argue that justice is what happens in courtrooms, not in abandoned quarries. Martin felt a chill, but kept his expression neutral. "I'm not sure I understand your implication." Agent Strickland reached into her briefcase and produced a file folder, which she placed on the coffee table between them. Martin Kane's military records make for fascinating reading. Special forces, multiple deployments, specialized training in psychological operations, and unconventional warfare. The kind of man who could disappear into hostile territory and emerge months later, having accomplished impossible missions. She opened the folder to reveal photographs that made Martin's blood run cold. Surveillance shots of him entering and leaving various locations in Millbrook during his investigation period. Someone had been watching the watcher. The interesting thing about psychological operations specialists, Strickland continued, is that they're trained to create false narratives that serve tactical objectives. They're experts at manipulating evidence, controlling information flow, and convincing people to believe stories that aren't quite true. Martin's mind raced through possible responses and escape routes, but he maintained his calm exterior. "Agent Strickland, I'm still not sure what you're suggesting. I'm suggesting that Martin Kane didn't die in that helicopter crash. I'm suggesting that he survived, made his way home, and discovered what had happened to his family. I'm suggesting that everything that followed, the investigation, the evidence, even Agent Christopher Elliott, was an elaborate psychological operation designed to achieve one goal: rescuing his daughter and punishing the people who had destroyed his life." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Martin felt the familiar surge of combat adrenaline, but forced himself to remain still and calm. "That's quite a theory," he said. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "Some. The surveillance photos show someone who moves like military personnel, someone familiar with tactical procedures and operational security. The investigation was conducted with the kind of precision that suggests professional training. And most tellingly, Agent Christopher Elliott doesn't exist in any DoD database, despite having conducted an official federal investigation." Strickland closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "But evidence isn't my primary concern here, Mr. Elliott. Results are." Martin raised an eyebrow. "Results? Wayne Burns was a corrupt cop who deserved everything he got. Cheryl Kane was complicit in child abuse and insurance fraud. Both of them received appropriate consequences for their actions. A little girl who was being systematically destroyed is now safe and thriving. From the FBI's perspective, that's a remarkably positive outcome." The conversation had taken an unexpected turn, and Martin found himself reassessing Agent Strickland's motivations. "I'm not sure I understand your position. My position is that sometimes the system fails people who deserve better. Sometimes good people are forced to work outside official channels to achieve justice that the courts can't or won't provide. And sometimes the FBI decides that certain investigations aren't worth pursuing, especially when the alternative would be to punish someone who protected a child from abuse." Strickland stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful Virginia countryside. Hypothetically speaking, if Martin Kane had survived that crash and orchestrated everything that followed, the FBI would have several options. We could pursue a complex investigation that would likely destroy an innocent child's new life, spend enormous resources prosecuting a man who saved his daughter from abuse, and ultimately achieve nothing except satisfying bureaucratic requirements for paperwork accuracy. She turned back to Martin with a slight smile. Or we could decide that our resources are better spent on cases where the bad guys haven't already been appropriately punished. Martin felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. And which option is the FBI choosing? The file on the Millbrook investigation is being officially closed. Agent Christopher Elliott's identification documents will be quietly archived as part of a routine administrative cleanup. And Marcus Elliott will continue to live peacefully in Virginia with his daughter, secure in the knowledge that his past is his own business. Agent Strickland finished her coffee and prepared to leave. The FBI does ask one favor in return for this understanding, which is, if you ever feel the need to conduct another unofficial investigation, please consider reaching out to us first. We have resources that might help you achieve your objectives through more conventional means. As Strickland reached the door, she paused and looked back at Martin one final time. Your daughter is lucky to have you, Mr. Elliott. Take care of her. After the FBI agent left, Martin sat alone in his living room for a long time, processing the conversation and its implications. The ghost of Martin Kane could finally rest completely, secure in the knowledge that no official investigation would ever threaten Emma's new life. When Emma returned from her sleepover the next morning, she found her father making pancakes and humming an old song she'd never heard before. You seem happy today, Daddy, she observed as she climbed onto her favorite kitchen stool. I am happy, sweetheart. Very happy. Why? Martin smiled as he flipped a pancake with practiced precision. Because sometimes good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people, and justice finds a way to work itself out. Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 9-year-old worldview. Like in the fairy tales? Exactly like in the fairy tales. As they ate breakfast together, Martin reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. He lost everything, survived the worst that human cruelty could devise, and fought his way back to build something better from the ashes of his former life. The boy who'd joined the army to serve his country was gone. The soldier who'd survived the POW camp was a memory. Even the ghost who'd returned to Millbrook had faded into history. What remained was a father, a protector, and a man who'd learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for nations or causes, but for the people we love most. Martin Kane's war was finally over. His victory was complete, and his daughter would never have to know the price that victory had required. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.